faces from classes this semester or previous semesters. Thank you so much for being here. I do want to make you aware, if you are here for extra credit, like my students probably are, there are slips up here. You can get it at the event that kind of document that you were in attendance today. So welcome to the Great Presidents, Evaluating Great Presidents panel of Constitution Week. This event has its origins in a conversation. Dr. Strike approached me last spring and said, hey, this is an election year. This fall, a lot of people are going to be thinking about the presidency and what makes a good president, what makes a great president. We often hear these rankings come out every so often, every few years, about what makes it, who the best presidents in U.S. history were. And Dr. Strike asked me, hey, what if we had an interdisciplinary panel of historians and political scientists that presented on some of those considerations that go into those rankings? And I thought that was a wonderful idea, so we were able to put together a wonderful panel here, a blend of historians and political scientists. So I will introduce our speakers, and before I hand the mic off to them, I'll share with you kind of our structure for our time in this session. So first up will be Dr. John Taylor, a professor of history. Next will be Dr. James Staub, a professor of political science. Third will be Dr. Greg Strike, the chair of the Department of Government Law and International Affairs. I'm still getting that one down. And a professor of political science. And finally, we'll have Dr. Francesca Langer, an assistant professor of history. So the way this is going to work is we're going to spend about 40 minutes of our time doing presentations. That's about 10. Each panelist has up to 10 minutes. I'll be keeping time. And then we're going to turn over to an interactive feature. So if you have your cell phones, you'll need that about 40 minutes in to kind of do some questions and some interaction about who you think are some of the greatest presidents. And then we'll round that out with some questions and answers. Sound good? All right, well, without further ado, we can get this show on the road, and I will hand it off to Dr. John Taylor.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thanks also to the American Democracy Project for sponsoring this panel today. So thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about Harry Truman, who's the only Missourian to serve as President of the United States. And one of the kind of things that I focus on when you're rating presidents is looking at how the folks at the time viewed them versus how they come to be viewed or ranked in some of these polls. And so when we look at Harry Truman, he comes into office in April of 1945 after Franklin Roosevelt dies. These polls are from the early Gallup polls. One of the first polls taken on Truman's kind of approval rating was in June of 1945. His approval rating was 87%. 87% approval rate. Extremely high. Now, what you see happen towards the end of his presidency, by February of 1952, his approval rating had dropped to 22%. What in the world had gone on? There was a lot that had gone on. And so in 52, Americans were really fed up with Harry Truman. And so the challenge, that was how the folks at the time viewed him. 22% approval rate. So what were Truman's challenges? So after his presidency, and from this period from 1945 until 1952, when he leaves office, he faced a number of things. When Harry Truman took office, the Second World War had not concluded. Harry Truman oversees the ending of the Second World War. It's a significant event. And he also faced reconversion from a post-war, from a wartime to a post-wartime economy in 1946. And his approval ratings really significantly tanked because Americans were not pleased with how that that those readjustments were made. He also oversaw the development of the containment policy in terms of the Cold War. And so part of that containment policy was the Marshall Plan, which was an economic recovery aid plan for Europe after the war. He was responsible for creating NATO, which is still with us today. And so most Americans in February of 1953 probably were not thinking about some of these achievements. Some of his other achievements, which really had gone unnoticed, was really in the area of civil rights. And so he actually created a commission that looked at the status of civil rights during the Cold War. And that commission produced a report that's called To Secure These Rights. It was a damning indictment of the United States, how it had dealt with the civil rights of all Americans. It certainly looked at African Americans, it looked at Japanese internment. It is a comprehensive document that still really is not fully utilized. It's called To Secure These Rights. And out of that, he then later, on the eve of the 1948 presidential election, he integrates, issues the executive order that results in the integration of the military. He also issued another executive order that integrated federal service, which is also usually not discussed. The integration of the military, he had a commission that looked at that. It also issued a report. It was called Freedom to Serve. So To Secure These Rights and Freedom to Serve are two of the most significant documents ever issued by the executive, the president, in the 20th century. And they have largely gone unnoticed. So why does his approval rating sink in 1952? The United States was involved in the Korean War, and that was a situation. It was part of the containment policy, and the Korean War was not going very well. And so many Americans primarily looked at the Korean War and the United States kind of challenging involvement there, and they were ready to say, look, we need essentially a change. Truman decides not to seek re-election. He could have run for a second term, but he decides not to do so. So this is one of the rankings. There are a number of other ranking systems. My colleague, Dr. Staub, will be talking about some of them. This is a C-SPAN ranking. They rank the presidents in all of these different categories: public persuasion, crisis leadership, economic management, and you can certainly go on down: pursuit equal justice, performance within context of times. So this is the most current 2021 C-SPAN rankings for the overall. So the overall ranking includes all of these rankings in their compiled. So Truman left office with a 22% approval rating, 1953. Today he's usually among the top 5 or top 6 presidents ever to serve, based on how individuals have kind of assessed some of the challenges or his way in which he managed different challenges throughout his presidency. So now I'll kind of compare some different categories. So these are two of the categories that you saw on the previous slide: the leadership and pursuit equal justice for all. And I'll just kind of compare him with Franklin Roosevelt. So in crisis leadership, Franklin Roosevelt scores above Harry Truman. Again, Roosevelt was elected 4 times and kind of presided over the United States involvement in the Second World War. Harry Truman is the one that kind of finishes the United States involvement as president, and so he usually is ranked pretty high here. Also, part of that ranking is how he addressed the strategy in terms of its containment strategy within the Cold War. Some of that factors in here. So Truman kind of ranks below Roosevelt in that crisis leadership category. Now, if you look at the pursuit of equal justice for all, you can see Truman ranking above Franklin Roosevelt. And a lot of that has to do with the actions that he'd taken on civil rights. Whereas Franklin Roosevelt, in many ways, kind of refused to integrate the military, Harry Truman certainly achieved that and pushed the issue of civil rights to the forefront even more. So I will let Dr. Staub talk a little bit more about some of these ranking systems.
Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing out there? I'm hoping this is picking up. It doesn't seem like it's amplifying in here, but maybe I'm wrong. Somebody is shaking their head in the back that it's not. It doesn't appear to be. So I'll try to speak up as loudly as I possibly can be. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the different ranking systems that have been used over time. And they go all the way back to 1948, the Arthur Schlesinger poll, and hopefully you have 2 sheets of paper that indicate some of those polls. That was the original, so they haven't been around forever, but they have been around for some time, and a number of others have done this. So Schlesinger was a famous historian, American history at Harvard, and his son actually wrote extensively on the presidency. His son authored the book, The Imperial Presidency. So Schlesinger's pretty renowned individual. So you have, they're the front runners of doing the polling, particularly the father. And then I'm just citing some other examples. The Marinell daughter poll of 1970, Murray Blessing. That was a very large one. Interestingly, the Marinell one was sociologists did the poll. Marinell, if I'm not mistaken, was at KU. Murray and Blessing, Murray was a historian at Penn State. They had about 900 plus respondents and survey that responded to the survey. And then Lindgren and Calabresi, Calabresi is very much involved with the Federalist Society, so you get a tinge of a little bit more of a conservative kind of ranking, like one of the few polls you'll ever see that has Washington at the top. By and large, Lincoln is pretty much in his own class, and the competition really is between Washington, FDR for second and third. That's where it's very, very close. And then there's another drop-off. So those 3 are pretty much at the top. And the drop-off goes to typically Teddy Roosevelt, and then either Harry Truman or Eisenhower. They seem to be battling out in recent years. Truman was ahead, and then Eisenhower has jumped one ahead of him in recent polls. That could change. They're very close. So other good ones. So C-SPAN, as Dr. Taylor pointed out, it's a pretty sophisticated ranking system because they look at 10 different variables. And that's important because somebody could do well in one variable, but maybe not in another. So if I have it right, you can double check me on this. Nixon ranks 32 for any number of reasons, but he did very well in the area of international affairs, and rightly should. So that's a nice little touch that they're actually picking up on some of his initiatives with China and the Soviet Union. And so he actually does pretty well in that category. So I think the nuance there is pretty good. And then a recent one is political scientist. They have one in 2024. They actually ranked Joseph Biden, who comes in 14th in that particular poll. And the former President Trump ranks absolutely last in that particular poll. What's interesting about that one is they actually look at the partisan identification of the respondents, and while there is a little bit of difference between Republicans and Democrats or liberals and conservatives, the ranking is pretty low in both camps, so to speak. All right, so in terms of the variables, we all selected a couple of different ones. I'm doing vision or setting the agenda, and I have the honor of talking about Abraham Lincoln, who is pretty much in his own category, but for a couple of different ranking systems out there. So what's really interesting about Lincoln and Vision is he was a very pragmatic statesman. As you know, his basic position on slavery was that he would attempt in all ways not to let it extend in the federal territories. But where it already exists in the South, he would not touch those particular areas. That was his sort of position. And he only deviated from that position when the Civil War took place. On a personal level, it is important to note that from early on, he said he was naturally anti-slavery. Lincoln looked at slavery as morally repugnant from a very young age. But he allowed for the idea that, that he basically said, as a president, I didn't have the authority to do anything about slavery in the South. So his statesmanship is in some parts identified with public opinion. Lincoln would not have gotten elected from Illinois if he was an abolitionist. He impressively beats two abolitionists in that 1860 election. Chase, Salmon Chase, and William Seward, who were abolitionists and much more popular than Lincoln at the time. But Lincoln was very shrewd, and he got his people to the Chicago Convention. He wins, somewhat surprisingly. And he says, basically public opinion is very important. Lincoln never wanted to be too far out in front of public opinion. And you can see where he basically says public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. So he's very much in tune with that. But the things that changed Lincoln and why he got back into politics was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 and the egregious Dred Scott decision where the Supreme Court ruled that black persons in this country, free or enslaved, could not be citizens in this country. The worst decision in Supreme Court history, got Lincoln back into the game, and in his Senate campaign against Douglas, he famously had the House Divided speech, where he basically says, I don't really see it staying one way or the other. It's going to be one thing or the other. And you have to imagine he thought it was going to be free. So the Civil War does change things. His first inaugural address, where 7 states already seceded from the Union, and then 4 would secede immediately after that inaugural address. He basically, the third paragraph of the inaugural address is, he states his position. He says, we need not be enemies. We can be friends. But if the South is the aggressor, then they have changed the game. And essentially, the firing at Fort Sumter changed his views. He still was very cautious, though, in terms of emancipation. Some of his advisors wanted him to emancipate blacks in the South sooner than he did, but eventually he did. And that was in January of 1863, the famous Emancipation Proclamation, basically regarding this as a military necessity at the time. But Lincoln knew you can't go back. He knew once you free slaves, they're not going back into being treated as property. And so probably one of the most important documents in U.S. history, and certainly one of his famous ones, is the Gettysburg Address, short and sweet, where he basically says, nobody will remember the words spoken today, but we honor the people that were killed on the battlefield. And he was wrong about that, because we do remember the words that were spoken on that day. 77 years ago, he's going back to the Declaration of Independence. And the genius of Lincoln is he reconnects the constitutional principles of this country back to the Declaration of Independence. And so that is basically, will lead him eventually to push for the 13th Amendment, which you know. And the interesting thing about his leadership was, in some ways, leaders need to be followers. If you dictate when the people aren't ready to dictate, you almost become irrelevant. So he was very keenly aware of that particular idea. could say more, but I don't have time. In fact, I've been signaled already, so I don't know. I've got 1 minute on another variable, which is performance within context of time. Very interesting book that's been revised over time, and we'll have to probably pick this up in the Q&A session a little bit more. Skowronek from Yale, political scientist. First it's politics President make, and then he turns it into evaluating presidents in political time. It's very interesting about this work, and I'm going to have to be somewhat brief here, is Skowronek takes on the idea, how in the world do you try to compare a Chester Arthur to a JFK? Totally different eras, totally different challenges. And so what he does, he comes up with this idea of different classifications of leadership historically. He doesn't, in other words, he doesn't look at history in a linear way. He looks at it as points of episodes and cycles where opportunities and maybe even limits of leadership unfold. And so, and hopefully you know of some critical election theory, and I think Josh will give me about 30 more seconds. We've got regime builders here, and you can see who they are. These are individuals that radically change the structure of government, the political partisan identification of government, and not only do they change it, but they change it for their successors. Very interesting work here. And so Monroe, the era of good feelings, is a continuation of Jefferson. Polk is a continuation of Jackson, called Young Hickory, by the way. Teddy Roosevelt, I won't talk about it right now. It's a little bit, for me, it's a little bit more challenging. JFK is a continuation of FDR. In many ways it was. And George H.W. Bush, continuation of Reagan. And then you have periods of dysfunction or lack of credibility, and the regime essentially ends and something new comes up. So John Quincy Adams, Franklin Pierce, Herbert Hoover, right before the Great Depression, Jimmy Carter, George W. Bush, Donald Trump, we'll see. I think I got it close.
All right, thank you. I'm going to stay seated because I want to abide by my time, and I might do a little more reading than talk off the cuff, which I often do in class. But I'd like to start by thanking Dr. Bax and the American Democracy Project for helping organize, and my colleague Dr. Nygren for following up on my inquiry about holding this event, and thank you all for coming, whether you're here in person or watching live stream. So by now we've seen that presidents can leave office with rather low job approval ratings, but then turn out to be a top 5 or top 6 president. We've also seen Dr. Staub start to talk, and Dr. Taylor as well, about some of the individual criteria, the specific criteria that are used to evaluate great, good, not so great presidents. I'm going to talk about 2 things in my time here today. And I'm going to pick up on the theme of specific criteria, and I'm going to use the C-SPAN poll just for the sake of time, the most recent one in 2021. And so what I'm going to do is talk about the fact that you can be a top 10 president and still have a weak spot, right? And so Dr. Taylor, Dr. Staub were mentioning some of this already. But as you can see on the left side of the screen, Ronald Reagan came in at 9, right? Yep. Want to make sure. And you can see that he ranks high in many, many areas, right? And just for example, he ranks rather high in public persuasion. He ranks high in vision and setting the agenda. As a former actor, Ronald Reagan had a very effective communication style, both interpersonally and as well as on camera. His folksy charm endeared him to many Americans, and it helped him cultivate good relationships with Congress, even to the point that he became quite good friends with then Democratic Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. Coming off the Carter years, where America seemed weak, ineffective, Americans were held hostage in Iran, we had unemployment and inflation. Reagan came on the scene, elected in 1980, with high rhetoric of America as the shining city on the hill, the idea of our values, our institutions as a beacon for other countries, and we were willing to stand up against the evil empire that was the Soviet Union. So he had several things going for him as being a very good, very effective president. However, I highlighted one area where he is in the bottom half, or worse. He ranks quite low in his administrative skills, and there are a few reasons for this. First, his strength really was in agenda setting and communication, not really the nitty-gritty administration of policies. He left those details to other people, and perhaps that came back to bite him. Because during his administration, more than 200 individuals were suspected of ethical and criminal, and they were subject to ethical and criminal investigation. Alleged crime and actual crime during the Reagan administration exceeded that of previous presidents, including Nixon, Harding, Grant, and Buchanan. There were insider trading scandals, a very costly savings and loan scandal, as well as scandals at the federal agencies such as HUD and the EPA. Most infamously, Reagan was embroiled in the Iran-Contra scandal, in which people in his administration bypassed the federal law to sell arms to the Iranians and then funneled the proceedings to support the Contras, which were then a paramilitary force fighting against the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. On the right, you see recently President Barack Obama has entered the rankings rather high, and he comes in ranked as 10th overall in the C-SPAN 2021 poll. And you can also see some areas where he's ranked rather high, such as we've heard a minute ago, and other presidents, such as Truman, the pursuit of equal justice for all, as well as moral authority, just to give two examples. Obama promoted racial equality in the United States in part by appointing Eric Holder as his Attorney General, who directed the Justice Department to focus more intensely on civil and voting rights cases. And during the second term of the Obama administration, this was a unique period in time where we saw a slow shift towards the embracement of the right of same-sex marriage, not just civil unions, but a full-fledged embracement of civil rights, the right to same-sex marriage. First, it was Vice President Biden that came out in favor of it. Later, President Obama came out in favor of it. And in terms of moral authority, President Obama reasserted the leadership role of the United States in global affairs. At the end of the Bush administration, it was rather in tatters, given some of the global opposition to the war on terror, controversies with the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, left the United States relatively diminished in terms of its respect around the world. And President Obama came in and reasserted the ideas, not unlike Ronald Reagan, that America is going to serve by example and uphold liberal democratic values and promote human rights and democracy. However, as you can see, I highlighted one area where he ranks rather low, particularly his relationship with Congress. In his first 2 years, you might remember, he had a Democratic majority in Congress, which helped him pass major landmark legislation, popularly known as Obamacare, otherwise known as the Affordable Care Act. However, that honeymoon didn't last long, because in 2010, the Tea Party emerged as a potent force in American politics, leading to a switch over in the House and the Senate to Republican control, making the next 6 years of the Obama presidency very difficult indeed. In order to pass any legislation, it was quite difficult sledding. This reached a couple of flashpoints. Some of you may remember in 2009, even before the Tea Party election, President Obama was giving a speech to the joint session of Congress where he was defending his Affordable Care Act, and there was one member of Congress who literally shouted out, "You lie." That has never been done in modern times. It was such a breach of protocol, but it was a sign of things to come, the difficult relationship with Congress. One other example real quick, when my colleague Dr. Staub has written several books about former Justice Scalia, but when Justice Scalia died on February 13th, 2016, and later within a few weeks, President Obama nominated a Circuit Court Judge, Merrick Garland, to take his spot on the court, Mitch McConnell refused to act. He invoked the idea that it's an election year and we'll wait for the presidential election to occur and then we'll decide which way to go. That again was unprecedented, and there were many people on the Democratic side that wanted Obama to push Congress to have a hearing, to meet with Merrick Garland and have a confirmation hearing. But I think this is where Obama, as a relatively inexperienced senator when he was elected, he did not have the deep connections with colleagues that a Lyndon Johnson would have or a Joe Biden would have, that he just was not able to work with colleagues in the Senate or in Congress in the latter part of his term. So therefore, he gets rather low marks for his relationship with Congress. One more item that I'd like to discuss. How am I doing on time? 3? Okay. one other kind of thing that I want to highlight are the fact that times change, our evaluations change, and some presidents have risen in the polls and others have fallen in the polls. And so I'm just drawing straight from the C-SPAN 2021 survey. And you have handouts that Dr. Staub has photocopied for you, and you see, if you go back in time, Ulysses S. Grant was, for a period of time, ranked as a failure. He was ranked as bottom 2, bottom 3, right? A bottom dweller as far as presidents go. But you can see that from 2000 to 2021, Grant has risen in the rankings. He had the highest jump of all presidents in the C-SPAN poll. Not that he's in the top 10, but by going up 13 spots is rather impressive. What gives? Why? Reassessment, historical and political science, folks look at his record and say, well, what was he doing? What did he deal with? What's his legacy, right? So one reason why he was ranked low is because he wasn't a politician. He didn't like politics, right? As a general coming into the presidency, he thought that was beneath him. His administration was rife with corruption, and under him, Congress kind of took back the reins of power, leading to a weakened presidency. But more recently, Grant is seen in a little bit more of a positive light, in particular for his fight for Black American rights, which culminated in the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote. He was, although many in his administration were corrupt, his own personal integrity was never brought into question. He undertook civil service reform, improved U.S.-UK relations. So all of a sudden, in hindsight, he doesn't look like the worst president ever, right? There are certain things that he did that in the passage of time, he's risen in these assessments. On the other side of that image, you see a faller, Andrew Jackson, for a period of time. If you look at those surveys that you have, for a period of time, he was seen as a top president, right? Top 5, top 10, greatest, however the rankings labeled him, right? Well, what did he do that deserved that ranking? Well, his legacy is very complicated. He creates the Democratic Party, the two-party system. He expanded the scope of presidential authority. He paid off the national debt during his administration. He appealed to voters using clear populist language, which was very different than speaking to Congress. He spoke directly to the people. However, more recently, again, he's kind of fallen in the rankings for historical reassessment and changing views of things that he did. So on terms of substance and style, finishing up in a second. Okay, thanks. Substantively, very infamously, he failed to recognize key Supreme Court decisions, in particular the Worcester versus Georgia decision that granted the Cherokee Nation sovereign control over the land that they held in the state of Georgia. He famously said, it's the Supreme Court, it's John Marshall's decision, let him enforce it, right? So the fact that he just flagrantly ignores the ruling. And then after that, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 infamously moves tens of thousands of Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole people from the southeastern states to what is now called Oklahoma. In terms of his style, as much as he's famous for his direct, plain-spoken ways, he also used excessive rhetoric that demonized his opponents, and psychologically he's now seen as a vengeful, spiteful person, right? So those kinds of reassessments are some of the reasons why he's a faller in these rankings. My final point is all of the rankings, most of the rankings that you look at, whether going back to 1948 or through 2024, on the left is the C-SPAN, on the right is the great presidents from 2024. You see a top 3 that really doesn't change, right? You can put them in wherever you want, but the top 3, there's a consensus. Lincoln, Washington, and FDR, right? And so to find out why those 3 are considered top 3 presidents, I'm going to yield the floor to my colleague, Dr. Francesca Langer.
So, this being Constitution Week, I want to start by talking about the Constitution. I think part of how we evaluate presidents in the United States has to do with how they are seen as upholding the Constitution, right? And I think in the United States we have something of a cult of the Constitution, or the founding documents, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And I think there are 3 main aspects to this. If you ask people at the time when the Constitution was written what sort of politics, what sort of ideology it represented, they would have told you it was Republican. It's a civic Republican document. And an important aspect of civic republicanism is the idea of citizenship and civic virtue. So a virtuous president is one who upholds the common good and protects the republic, protects the Constitution. I think the American Republic, because it's not grounded in a certain race or ethnicity, it's grounded in a set of ideas. The way Americans generally understand the president defending the republic is that he defends the Constitution, he upholds the Constitution. Another aspect of this, which we perhaps inherited from the Puritans, is something I'm calling Protestant textualism. So the relationship that Americans have to the US Constitution, I think, is somewhat unique. It's not really the same as the relationship most countries have to their Constitution. Our Constitution is among the oldest in the world. We haven't overturned it since 1787. Most countries have gone through multiple constitutions since 1787. We still have the same one. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that Americans treat the Constitution almost as a kind of scripture. It has an almost quasi-supernatural quality to it. Another aspect of this cult of the Constitution, which is perhaps in contradiction with the previous one I mentioned, is this idea of Enlightenment utopianism. The idea that when the Constitution was written, it was, the most learned men of the day sat down and they set out to design the most rational, enlightened system. They were inspired by Enlightenment philosophy. So they weren't necessarily following tradition or what came before. They were trying to devise the best system. So I think part of the legitimacy of the Constitution, part of why Americans view it in this way, is because they see it as representing this kind of rational, enlightened process. They don't think it's arbitrary, right? So the greatest presidents are the ones who are seen as upholding and defending the republic as embodied by the Constitution and these kind of founding ideals. So why are the top three always the top three? First of all, we have George Washington. George Washington is obviously the first president, and I think he represents kind of a transition between monarchy and republicanism. He's not very democratic in the modern sense. He didn't compete in an election, really. He was kind of unanimously elected. So in that sense, his presidency wasn't super democratic by modern standards. He was treated by the people as almost a kind of quasi-king, as a kind of civic republican king, if that makes any sense. But he presents this model for all future presidents. So what kind of model does he represent? So the model that George Washington was following was the Roman general Cincinnatus, who was famous for leading Roman armies to victory and then peacefully setting aside his arms at the end of the war. So I think Washington, the ideal that he represents, the model that he represents for all future presidents, is this idea of civic virtue and humility, not being too ambitious, not being power hungry, right? Washington, he saved the republic by not making himself king, right? He gave in to the constitutional order. He willingly gave up power. You know, at the end of the Revolutionary War, he didn't use the Continental Army to march on Congress and make himself king. He willingly laid down his arms. And I think that's maybe the main reason that most Americans see him as one of the greatest presidents. That he set the tone for all future presidents, and he made this peaceful transition of power possible. At the end of his 2 terms, he did the same thing, right? He didn't seek a 3rd term. He humbly retired from the scene of public life. And that kind of set the precedent that most presidents have only served 2 terms. Next, we have Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, of course, is best known for preserving the Union during the Civil War, which is perhaps the most dramatic existential crisis that the Republic has ever faced. So he upheld the Constitution of 1787. He maintained that same constitutional order while also radically modifying it. So Lincoln is also best known for the abolition of slavery. So we have this pattern in United States history, I think, of radical, even revolutionary change through continuity. Instead of tearing up the Constitution and writing a new one every time one of these revolutionary periods occurs, we do this weird thing where we kind of maintain the same document, the same Constitution. You know, maybe we amend it a little bit, but largely what we do is kind of reinterpret it and recontextualize it for each new age. Many Americans see the Civil War as kind of a second American Revolution. And as you can see here, this is Lincoln, after his assassination, ascending to heaven, where he's embraced by George Washington, who's already there, right? They're bros, they're embracing. And this is to show you that even though the Civil War, and especially the abolition of slavery, represents a very dramatic, even revolutionary transformation of American society, the way that it was framed, the way that it was understood by most Americans at the time, and I think still, is not as a repudiation or an overturning of the previous order, but an expansion of it. So it's not undoing the American Revolution, it's expanding on, it's extending the American Revolution. And here we see Washington is embracing Lincoln, right? They're on the same page, right? Lincoln he's carrying the torch that Washington, started. Finally, we have Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, I think, is also seen as kind of saving the Republic in this time of existential crisis. The Great Depression and World War II represented a global crisis of liberal democracy, a crisis of 19th century liberalism, and a crisis of capitalism globally. And the question became, can this document, the 1787 Constitution, can it still work in a modern industrial age? It was written at a time of horse-drawn carriages and flintlock pistols, right? What can it possibly have to say to us in the midst of the Great Depression and World War II? I think the New Deal offers kind of an answer to the challenge posed by both communism and fascism. Communism on the left and fascism on the right represented these radical alternatives to 19th century liberalism. And the United States, unlike much of Europe, charted this kind of middle path. It maintained this kind of liberal constitution based on these civic Republican Enlightenment values, but it modified them in order to keep pace with the times. And I think FDR is remembered as one of the greatest presidents because he kind of threaded this impossible needle of bringing this yeoman republic of Washington and Jefferson, of the American Revolution, into the 20th century. This is Jefferson Memorial, a statue of Jefferson from the Jefferson Memorial, which was dedicated by FDR. So FDR wanted to associate his administration and the New Deal with the legacy of the American Revolution. I think throughout U.S. history we've seen this pattern of this kind of conservative style of revolution, of radical change through continuity. So even though the United States of the 1930s is completely unrecognizable from the United States of the 18th century, there is still a sense of continuity which is maintained through this fealty to the Constitution and to the Republic. And I think Americans think of these presidents as the top three, as the greatest presidents, because they are seen as defending the Republic in these times of existential crisis.
All right. Well, thank you all. We give one more round of applause. We'll do another at the end for all the panelists. I think it's very illuminating where these rankings come from, how they've changed over time, and how they've stayed the same. So now we are coming to the interactive portion of our event today. If you have a cell phone or tablet or something like that, you can interact. Oh, thank you. So this is a program called Poll Everywhere. Dr. Strike, you've used this before. Do you want to share a little bit how this works?
Last year it didn't work so hot, so hopefully by now you should be able to log on 3 different ways. Scan the QR code, or if you're on a laptop or some other device, you can go to the polleverywhere.com/ you can see it there, or send a text. This is on my account, so it's kind of using my first name and half of my last name. At some point you should be able to log on, and then we have a series of questions that are word clouds. So you should then be able to answer the question, type in the last name of whatever the question is asking for.
So as you enter your answers,
It's working today.
the names will pop up. There we go.
Yeah,
We have
there we go.
Lincoln up here already.
It's working.
So the bigger the text, the more people who are submitting that answer.
So, and maybe we minimize the QR. I'm not sure.
Did everyone get a chance to scan the QR code? maybe we'll, does anybody need it larger still? Yeah, okay. Right. So far no one's breaking from the usual top three.
Roosevelt, FDR.
See,
Acronyms are
see movement in the font size. That's how
Oh, I know. I was wondering about that too.
Sort of, yeah, as far as like, well,
Is anybody having trouble submitting their, yeah? You can't get the QR code? Oh, it is large.
Can you go multiple times?
Maybe go to join by the,
Buchanan.
the
James
address there,
Buchanan.
full /.
Oh, man.
Dallas, I think that was
Gregory.
Yeah, SDREI.
I think we're going to have to identify that one. I want to know.
That feels like a troll choice.
Who's going to stand behind that one?
It'll be Gregory.
John Quincy.
Okay, so
SDREI.
there.
STR.
So, okay, FDR is okay.
James Buchanan, somebody. You can take that one.
I would love to speak to that one.
Yeah.
If asked. If asked.
I hereby announce my candidacy.
Strike.
Oh, look at that.
For bonus points there.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's James, is it James Strike? Oh,
Yeah.
no, it's Gregory.
Mr. Armstrong, you're up there now.
So we're seeing this one, I don't know if you are still submitting your answer, but if you feel comfortable, I'll come around if you want to share sort of the rationale that you use to submit your vote. You are invited to do so.
We got to get the Buchanan one first, though.
Yes, yes, Buchanan. That might be a first in any ranking system, other than his own. Any brave souls for Buchanan?
Somebody's in the back.
Yeah. I'll clean that up to be a smart aleck.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other folks, you know, we have a lot of the top three here, the Lincoln, the Washington, the FDR, Roosevelt.
But we have
Any,
JFK, we have
for those of you who maybe submitted
Theodore Roosevelt.
Washington or Roosevelt ahead of Lincoln, do you care to kind of share your rationale? This isn't a test, no right or wrong here, but we'd be happy to kind of have you contribute and share with your colleagues. Yes?
FDR did a very good job of that. Many things, with the New Deal, those ideas are very famous throughout time. But then also, I think FDR's ability to work with Congress is incredibly important for any president. He did a wonderful, very impressive job in that past legislation.
Does help when you have a Democratic Congress.
So
Yeah.
the vision,
And overwhelming.
and sort of maybe the moral authority, moral leadership, but also the relationships with Congress that FDR had, and which were necessary in order to achieve the things we heard about in our first meeting. What else? Any Washington fans here?
So one of the biggest reasons I chose this Washington over Lincoln was, I mean, he really said, as Dr. Lager said, really build a good pedestal for the rest of the presidency to kind of go off of. I think about Washington, or have Lincoln, or have FDR, and these like big, broad, visionary ideas about Washington. I think he did a good job of setting our nation forward and on a good percent.
I like the pedestal.
Yeah, it's really, how do you become a president when there's no model for that presidency other than someone who lived 2,000 or 1,700 years ago, or whatever it was, I'm not sure. When was Cincinnati?
I'm not sure. Cincinnati is semi-legendary, so
A long time ago, centuries. We'll leave it
he
there.
probably existed, but not. We don't know that much about him.
Any other folks folks want to share? We have a Theodore Roosevelt, we have a Truman,
Kennedy.
a Kennedy.
Go to the next one.
Yeah,
We've got other questions here, so let's do this. Will they stay signed in?
yeah.
Okay. I'll be right down here. Okay. Oh. Maybe, haven't answered this yet?
Oh, there it is. Most over.
Okay, we've gotten overrated.
Ooh.
We've got answers coming for
You're already
overrated.
answering, so we'll leave it. We'll leave it up. We'll try to find that other one. It might have fell through the cracks.
Yes.
Teddy.
Someone had asked, like, who would you have?
Interesting.
Oh, yeah.
If there are chance breakouts of overrated, I won't begrudge you.
Should we, everybody's still logged in, right?
Yeah. Is anyone having any issues with the login? Got kicked out?
You got the presidential greatness, because there's that, they have the overrated, underrated at the bottom.
Yeah.
Did you
Yeah,
read
that was pretty good.
Yeah.
I like that.
Did you,
Who did they say was
I
the most
appreciate sharing
underrated?
that one with us.
underrated,
Kinda
overrated was
incorporate
like
that great
JFK.
Oh, yeah.
Underrated, I can't remember, I saved that in print out.
Reagan and Jackson right now.
I did see that.
Top spot for this group.
I just thought it was in light of what
Trump,
some
Clinton, Jefferson.
Good old Buchanan. Oh, Trump.
George, which George?
Yeah, there's lots of George. George Orwell, George. What other George we have to pick from?
Yeah, several Georges.
All right, so we've got a number of responses here. Anybody care to share their thoughts on overrated presidents?
I said Andrew Jackson because I think, well, he was a bigot. He was a slave owner and did like horrible things with the slaves. He was mostly responsible for the Trail of Tears, and he does have some of those like economic things, like relieve the debt. But I think that's a more superficial thing because you could also argue that he was responsible for the Panic of 1837, which kind of was one of the first severe economic crises in our country's history. And so, while he did do some good things, he also did some very harmful things that will tarnish our country's history forever.
Grant, other responses?
I said Reagan because I think that it's hard because he's super renowned with Republicans and he's really, really loved. But I just think that trickle-down economics was not a smart idea in the long run. But I actually think the biggest thing he did was his refusal to acknowledge and deal with the AIDS crisis in the 80s. To me, that just loses so much capital. Seeing you're not acknowledging a very big part of the crisis.
Thank you. What else? Anybody else?
The Camelot Mystique. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, JFK maybe is renowned simply because of being assassinated. It's response. You know, there are some good things that comes out of his presidency, but maybe his legend overshadows his accomplishments.
Might be a bit bold, but I think Teddy Roosevelt's a bit overrated. I feel, again, he does start the era, the progressive era, but I do feel like he's a bit overrated compared to his successors, particularly Wilson when it comes to actually putting down reforms in legislation and law. Yeah.
being overrated for lacking accomplishments, maybe the persona, in this case, is what he's renowned for. What else? Anything else? Let's do another one. Who's underrated?
John Quincy Adams.
Those are good questions. Yeah. I might have to use those in my classes. Because it avoids the whole thing of, everybody saying the same presidents.
LBJ.
So which one's the most, what did you say for Jessica? Oh, JQ? Yeah.
He's not the greatest president, but he's my pick for maybe the goodest president.
Yeah.
A couple 19th century presidents, but mostly 20th to 21st so far. Adams.
John. Yeah, maybe John. I think I see a John, so maybe John Adams.
No.
Which
Yeah.
John Biden.
Looks like LBJ and Obama are tied right now because their font is the same side and they're leading into each other. All right, is this come in? What's anybody care to share what you're thinking here?
John Johnson.
John who? Yeah.
And so underrated, we're missing something that we should be factoring into greater.
Gary.
I feel like especially in recent years, LBJ is going through a kind of a reanalysis due to the way the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act have become more denigrated and attacked over the past few years, especially through the courts. I feel like that is, I feel like we analyzing how big of an accomplishment that was, especially after 100 years of delayed civil rights action is very important. And on top of the Great Society and many accomplishments that came from that.
Okay, so if you didn't hear that, LBJ, because of some landmark achievements like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, but also the Great Society programs. What else? Anybody else?
So he scores twos in the equal justice, which is interesting, right below Lincoln. Yeah, he would, he should rate high. He should be higher. Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, it's just the voting, it's the Vietnam.
As a whole, and that was extremely important for me. Stop people incentives that they're trying to run. And there was so much corruption, and then he set forefront classical liberalism, wiped it out, and at the time he got fair politics, well, somewhat fair politics for that.
Civil Service Act.
Okay. He was a bit of a
Okay,
reformer.
another hand. This is great, you all. Thank you so much.
I said Grant because he, like, sure there was a lot of corruption in his presidency, but I don't think you can completely fault him for that, because he also fought, like, very strongly for civil rights. He, like, completely got rid of the KKK temporarily. And he also fought for, he fought for indigenous people's rights, which was something that, like, no one was doing at that time. So that was, he had a lot of very radical beliefs that I think he was trying to push our country forward, but maybe the country just wasn't ready for it.
So, yeah, Grant and the signing the Enforcement Acts, peace policy for Native Americans. What else? We have one or two more, I think. Yes. So, we kind of have this consensus of the top three that our panelists talked about. who would you add to top 5? Looks like we have Truman, LBJ, Obama is would appear to be the ones getting the most votes. Roosevelt, presumably Teddy Roosevelt, is making a run for the money. Carter, Jefferson, Reagan, Kennedy, Eisenhower.
So far.
Right. So anybody care to share the thought process here? If it's different from maybe what you've shared already.
Stop talking and staring at each other for a little bit. So I chose Obama. Really, the main reason was sort of analysis of current politics. It seems like we're more leaning toward things for a persona or something that can essentially engage with citizens. And I think Obama definitely did a really good job of that. That previous presidents that are in the top 3 also did a really good job of that. So I think that's something we want to start like critiquing and start like championing. I think Obama stuff is being up there. I mean, you can't please everybody. I know he's not really friends with Congress, but sometimes you can be friends with Congress as well as friends with the people.
Who else cares to share where they're at here? I'm wondering if any of the panelists have any sort of responses or sort of questions for our audience today based off of some of the polling responses we have.
I'll start, just not as a definitive answer, but just to kind of respond to a couple of comments. As far as the under or overrated presidents, for anybody that's curious, the Greatest Presidents Project website does have their white paper report, and there are rankings for the underrated, overrated, and John F. Kennedy does come in as the #1 overrated president, in part because of some of the comments that were made by the students. So I think you're all on track and making some really smart comments as far as justifying why certain presidents deserve to be considered higher or lower than they currently are. I'll yield the floor and maybe come back if anybody else wants to.
I'll just mention the other ones. I thought, I hope this mic is working. I don't know if any of them have been. I thought you did really well in identifying some of the most overrated and underrated. So underrated, according to this particular study, Jimmy Carter, Grant, George H.W. Bush, Eisenhower, LBJ, Biden, Truman, and then then overrated, Kennedy, Reagan, Jackson, Wilson, Jefferson, and I won't continue, but so you did really well. I didn't know if you wanted to say anything.
I have a question occurred to me as you all were giving your presentations. It struck me that many of you talked about the context of the presidency and how there's these opportunities where perhaps the context is as important for giving the president an opportunity, at the very least, to elevate themselves in their stature. I wonder also, to what extent can we see these
I think that's a really interesting question. So, pursue justice for all. I don't know if that was a variable in some of those other ranking systems going back to 1948. And that one, I think, definitely looks at something very different. So Jackson does not do very well there, but Obama and a number of other presidents do very well. Obviously, Lincoln and others. So I think that's very important. I think that C-SPAN poll it's got a lot of merit and legitimacy because they are looking at several different things. And as I said, a president can do well in one, but maybe not in another. And I think context is exceedingly important in terms of, and that's kind of the Skowronek work in some ways, that, Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s, Warren Harding ran on a campaign of return to normalcy. So if you're going to look at what presidents accomplished during their time in office, Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge are not going to do very well. And you could argue it's a tad bit of a bias towards liberal Democratic presidents who get lots of things passed. So, but during that time, people weren't looking for a lot. I mean, Calvin Coolidge was pretty well liked. Now Hoover, when he continued to be passive, leading, with the Great Depression, that changed things quite considerably. But, what do you say about those presidents in the 1920s where people really weren't looking for leadership as such? So context matters, and it has mattered historically in terms of opportunities to lead and maybe limitations of what one can do.
Let me add to the context and the reassessing over time depending on our current values. I agree that I think that's part of why certain presidents rise and why others fall. I would probably add Woodrow Wilson to that list as far as how we reassess him. He might score high in some categories as far as his international affairs approach or the World War I kind of attempt to create the League of Nations. There's certain things that he's historically ranked high on for that. But in terms of his domestic politics, especially with the pursuit of equal justice for all, he was a segregationist, and he brought segregation to the federal bureaucracy and to Washington, D.C. And after watching The Birth of the Nation, he was famously quoted as saying that was history written with lightning. So there are, again, in our 21st century views, he's retrograde on his racial views. And so that's one of the reasons why he's slid in the rankings, in part because of that criteria.
Yeah, so Birth of the Nation, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a film from 1914, I want to say, that was very favorable to the Ku Klux Klan and favorable to the sort of white supremacist view of the Reconstruction period of the 1860s and 1870s. And he screened it in the White House with a favorable viewing of that. Does anyone have any questions for the panelists? Maybe we can end on that.
How do you guys assess Polk's presidency?
Polk. I could probably say a few words about Polk.
So it's a good, interesting question. So James Polk is one of our first dark horse presidents. Went into the convention, and there was other persons that were more popular or got more votes than he did. And then when he was nominated by the Democratic Party, someone famously said, "Who's James Polk? Who is this person?" And of course, he would become the young Hickory and follow Jackson's policies. Polk is usually rated very favorably for a one-term president. So I don't know if you're serious about the question. He's actually rated pretty well. Last I would say like 12th or something. Somebody tell me what, he's usually rated very well. And it was manifest destiny during his time. Controversially too, though, because if you look at Pursue Justice for All, the backdrop of manifest destiny was the possible allowance of slavery in those territories that we acquired. And that was sort of underneath some of that. But he's recognized as fairly successful. I mean, we got Oregon, we got California, the Mexican War takes place, so he actually does very well. And he's one of those presidents, 4 years in, he looked completely different when he left. He aged like you wouldn't believe over 4 years. And he died very young, fairly soon after he left office. So a lot can be said about James Polk. Of whom? Anybody in particular, or just?
Just in like achievements that you think kind of help in like I mentioned earlier, like the Social Security Administration or like a single act achievements.
For
Oh.
those watching at home, the question was, what are some major achievements that a president has made that help really to define their presidency?
Oof. Wow. There's a lot. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, I mean, obviously Lincoln's is just, spot on. I mean, the navigation of the situation and able to achieve. He had a moral compass, and so we eradicate slavery. It's pretty hard to match that in some ways. But there's a lot of presidents that have had accomplishments, and you can look at some different programs. FDR certainly had a lot. You're very active presidents that pass lots of legislation. LBJ, civil rights. I mean, the greatest civil rights laws happened during his time. Civil Rights Act of '64, Voting Rights Act of '65, and then you get into Medicare and Medicaid, which we didn't have previous to that. He matches FDR in a lot of ways in terms of what he accomplished. His albatross is Vietnam. That's why he's rated so not as high as FDR would be because of Vietnam. So, but there's lots and lots of other presidents that have had major accomplishments, but those would be a few that I would mention.
As I mentioned in my presentation, if you're looking at Harry Truman, it's to secure these rights and freedom to serve. And Truman engaged on the issue of civil rights within the context of the Cold War. And that was something that FDR would not even tolerate. I kind of differ with FDR's rankings, even though he ranks below Truman. FDR did not want to anger the Southern Democrats. He needed the Southern Democrats to support the New Deal. And on the issue of race, he refused to budge. And I argue that I think Truman moves the Democratic Party even further than Franklin Roosevelt does. And that's usually not what you typically hear. That's what I'm working on in a book that I'm working on. So.
I would just concur, and in the fact that the 1948 Democratic National Party had a civil rights plank for the first time, and under Roosevelt he did make some concessions to those Southern Democrats for some of those great New Deal programs which we valorize or are still with us today. Southern black workers were not included. Agricultural workers, domestic workers were not covered by some of those same programs. One other thing to say about Lyndon Johnson, who very active, 8 years, to add on to one item of Dr. Staub, the Equal Housing Act of 1968, to finish kind of the trilogy of civil rights legislation in the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson, and fully agree that it was the Vietnam War that was his albatross, and one of the reasons why he's not more highly evaluated. My voice is starting to
And I would say, getting back to Truman, if you're looking at paving the way for Brown versus Board, it is some of those Supreme Court justices that he appoints that are very instrumental in that Brown v. Board decision 54, which again, that's usually not discussed.
Right, we are at our time, so I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for your participation and your questions. I think this is really emblematic of what not only American Democracy Project is about in terms of civic engagement, but what we're about here at UCM, which is providing you an education with which you can use to kind of be an informed citizen in the world. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for the Let's give everyone a round of applause.